Now resumed in public session, and I would like to welcome Mr. Martin Cooney, welcome here today, and Patrick Malay, thank you, yeah, Gerald Kiley, Robert Gibney, Owen Colgan, and Shane Morris. You're all very welcome to this meeting here today. Here from the RDFRA, Representative Reserve Defence Force Representative Association, and also representing the Naval Service Reserve and so on, and from the National Office. So the format of today is you were here this morning and we had an interaction with the Minister on this issue. So the format now will be to invite you now to make a brief opening submission, about 5 minutes or thereabouts, and then we'll have a question and answer session with members on that. There were votes actually just before the break and all, and things I think have moved on a bit, so we'll have other members joining us, I would expect shortly. So anyway, before you begin now, I have to draw to your attention of all witnesses to the situation in relation to privilege. You are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you are to give to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of any evidence you are giving. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charge against any person or entity by name in such a way as to make him, her, or it identifiable. And the members of the House should also be aware that under the salient rulings of the Chair, members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I think, Mr. Cooney, you're starting off, so I invite you to begin if you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman and members of the Joint Committee, I would like to commence by, first of all, thanking you for the invitation to come and address you here today and for the opportunity to give a presentation to you. As you've indicated, Chairman, I'm joined by my colleagues, Mr. Patrick Mully, who's Vice President of RDFRA, Mr. Gerard Kiley, who's President of RDFRA, Mr. Rob Gilby, a member of the Army Reserve, Mr. Owen Colgan, a member of the Naval Service Reserve, and Mr. Shane Morris, who's a member of the Naval Service Reserve. The objective of our presentation today is to seek to change the mindset in respect of how the Reserve Defence Force is utilised, and to request that the Joint Committee commission an independent review and report on the Reserve Defence Force with a view to identifying the real value for money with a Reserve Force and how this can be utilised in the Irish Defence Capability Framework. I thought it beneficial at the outset to give you a little information about the Reserve Defence Force. The Reserve Defence Force is the reserve component of Ireland's defence forces. Its roles are the exact same as those assigned to the Permanent Defence Force. However, the Reserve Defence Force's most important contribution is to support the Permanent Defence Forces in its contingency defence roles and other crisis situations. Therefore, in peacetime, the main function of the Reserve Defence Force is to train and prepare for these contingency roles. The Reserve Defence Force is comprised of the First Line Reserve, the Army Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve. The First Line Reserve is comprised of former members of the Permanent Defence Force who have a contractual obligation and commitment to the First Line Reserve. For the purpose of today's presentation, we are only concerned with the Army Reserve and the Naval Service Reserve. These are made up of volunteers who undertake military activities in their spare time. These volunteers come from all walks of life in Ireland, and they freely volunteer most of their reserve service. They do so in addition to work, study and family commitments, and they offer a wealth of civilian qualifications and experience that could be used by the state. The current establishment of the Reserve Defence Force is 4,069 volunteers, comprising 3,869 personnel in the Army Reserve and 200 personnel in the Naval Service Reserve. However, the figure is slightly higher at the moment as a result of numerous personnel serving without appointments resulting from the recent reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Force. The Reserve Defence Force Representative Association, or RDFRA, is the representative body that represents the interests of the members of the Reserve Defence Force within certain defined parameters. I understand that the Minister for Justice, Equality and Defence has already addressed you this morning with regard to the value for money review of the Reserve Defence Force. The RDFRA believe that there are major issues with the VFM review, and we object to its conclusions and the consequences that have come about as a result. It is not our intention to deal with the value for money review in any detail today. It is our opinion that it is too late to do so, as the Minister has already made his decisions based on its findings, and the reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Force is already well underway. However, we would like to make some general comments on the VFM review before moving on. It is our opinion that the VFM review is flawed on a number of different levels. It failed to make any qualitative evaluation of the input of the Permanent Defence Force into the Reserve Defence Force. It sets up biased comparisons in its case studies. It misinterprets evidence, and it includes no substantial analysis to support many of its claims. In addition, it completely ignores the operational capability, experience, and outputs of the Naval Service Reserve. It is unfortunate that there was no member of the RDFRA or indeed a member of the Reserve Defence Forces on the steering committee, and it would appear that the VFM review has been prepared with a certain bias in its approach and findings. We find it disappointing that a true opportunity has been missed to conduct a critical review of the Reserve Defence Force with a view to identifying how this valuable resource can be effectively used for the benefit of the state. The outcome of the VFM review and the latest reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Force run contrary to international trends, existing studies and reports on international comparators, and indeed previous studies on the Reserve Defence Forces. In the late 1990s, the then Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces commissioned a report entitled A Special Study on a Restructuring of the Reserve Defence Force, which was published in 1999. The report identified a multitude of strengths, positives, and value for money that exists in the Reserve Defence Force. It noted that the Reserve Defence Force add value to the state and the Defence Forces and the individuals and society in general. In particular, some of the key positives identified by the report are as follows. The system of military reserve is considered to be a cost-effective method of organising and maintaining a military capability. It offers youth a valuable outlet for natural curiosity and in turn infuses personnel with a sense of pride, discipline, confidence and organisation. It allows wealth-generating resources to be permanently employed in the national economy while also retaining the ability to deploy those same resources as contingency might dictate. And the Reserve offers the Permanent Defence Force access to skills and experiences which could not be maintained on a permanent basis in the Permanent Defence Force. We submit that these attributes remain the same today and that, with the right training and administrative infrastructure, the Reserve Defence Force represent a real value for money. One of the largest contributions that the Reserve Defence Force can make to the state and the Defence Forces is the ability to access a range of civilian qualifications and experience that the Defence Force is either deficient in or simply does not have. There can be many reasons why the Defence Forces may not have certain skills, and this can include funding restrictions, the length of time and cost associated with obtaining certain qualifications and skills, the fact that certain skills are only required on an occasional basis, and the loss of skills and experience due to personnel leaving the Defence Forces. The Reserve Defence Force, however, is comprised of personnel with varied and different backgrounds who have civilian skills and experience which the Defence Forces can call upon should the need arise. Further, the Reserve Defence Force offers the Defence Forces and the state the opportunity to procure certain skills, qualifications and experience at a much reduced cost than if external civilian agencies were engaged to provide the same services. The benefit and the cost effectiveness of the Reserve Defence Forces can be best illustrated using some examples. There has recently been a deficiency of medical doctors in the Defence Forces. This has a significant implication not only for the health and well-being of the Defence Forces in general, but also on the operational capability and output. In such instances, the Defence Forces must engage the services of civilian doctors to carry out the duties when there are no Defence Forces personnel available. I have been advised that the cost of a normal medical examination of a recruit is €90 per recruit. If you take the position that the civilian doctor sees 8 recruits a day, that's a cost of €720 a day. By 5 days, it's €3,600 for the week. In contrast, if the Defence Forces mobilised a doctor in the Reserve Defence Force to conduct the same medicals for a week, the cost to the Defence Forces would be 1 week's pay for that individual. Let us say that the doctor holds the rank of captain, then their weekly pay would be in the region of €1,116 for a 7-day week. The value for money is immediately obvious. Likewise, the value increases with the more personnel that the reserve doctor sees. One could also easily imagine a situation where the Defence Forces would require the advice of a solicitor in a specialist area. Let us say that the average hourly rate of such a solicitor is €250 per hour. Let us say that the solicitor spent 40 hours advising, i.e. 5 days by 8 hours. Then the bill for this advice would be €10,000 plus VAT. However, if a member of the Reserve Defence Force who is a solicitor with the same skills was mobilised for a week to provide the advice, at the rank of captain, they would cost the Defence Forces €940 for a 7-day week. These examples assume that the reservist holds the rank of captain, as generally personnel with certain qualifications enter into the Defence Forces on a direct entry system at a certain rank. However, this is not always the case with the Reserve Defence Force, as personnel must engage in the enlisted ranks and work their way up before they are put on a potential officer's course. Therefore, you could have examples of reservists with these qualifications who hold a lower rank. I know of 2 solicitors who held the rank of corporal before they went on to complete their potential officer's course and be commissioned as officers in the reserve. At the rank of corporal, their mobilisation would have cost €568.97 a week at the time. They currently hold the rank of second lieutenant, so mobilisation at this rank would cost €577.40. Whatever way you look at it, it represents a significant saving and value for money. Similar examples can be provided for other professionals and qualifications, such as mechanics, cooks, electricians, nurses, architects, and so on. It should also be borne in mind that the reservist does not only bring their own skills and experience to the fore, but they often have access to their employer organisations and colleagues for support. These benefits do not represent a direct cost to the Defence Forces and provide an additional benefit in engaging reservists to carry out the task. Ireland has so far missed the opportunity to exploit the pool of human talent that exists within the Reserve Defence Force. Many nations have identified the significant value of reservists, with value going far beyond cost benefits. Australia allows qualified pilots to fly their military logistic planes as reservists. The UK deploys entire subunits of reservists on training missions overseas. They are currently putting together expeditionary units of field hospitals, which will be solely comprised of reservists. Among all international comparators identified in the Value for Money review, reservists play a role in the domestic aid to the civil authority operations, whether it is humanitarian relief in Canada, security at the 2012 Olympics, disaster relief following the Canterbury earthquakes, or providing camp maintenance in Australia. All international comparators have developed systems to enable reservists to serve. Ireland's lack of employment legislation differentiates us from our international comparators, as it is a key enabler for the mobilisation of reservists. The lack of such protection deters people from joining or from staying in the reserves, and this is something that will require attention in the future. Given the nature and the time limit on this presentation, we have only attempted to give an overview of the benefits of the Reserve Defence Force. The Reserve Defence Forces offers many benefits in addition to its civilian skills, including in relation to society in general. Reservists offer significant societal benefits as they can act as a conduit between communities and the state. As the geographical footprint of the Permanent Defence Forces becomes smaller due to the consolidation of permanent locations, the Reserve Defence Force provide an opportunity to offer community-based defence installations at a minimal cost. Response in support of aid to the civil authority is an important area where localism, volunteering and the Defence Forces can be substantiated by viable, positive reservist actions. A fundamental tenet of what we are saying is that Ireland has not taken advantage of its Reserve Defence Force. There is significant potential among the thousands of citizens who volunteer themselves and give up their time on a regular and ongoing basis. Now is the time to regulate this resource and exploit its potential. Given Ireland's economic outlook and the fact that the state is looking for ways to reduce costs and increase output, the Reserve Defence Force offers a viable, low-budget option to augment the permanent defence forces and to provide the state with the skills and experience which are often sorely lacking. This potential has not been used to date, despite the willingness, enthusiasm and ability of the Reserve Defence Force. There is a real risk that, as a result of the Value for Money review and the current reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Force, that this organisation will cease to exist in 3 years' time. If this does arise, the qualifications, skills, experience, history and tradition of the Reserve Defence Force will be lost, and it will prove disproportionately costly when it is gone. Like any natural resource, it is too late to seek to preserve it when you've wasted it. In conclusion, The VFM review and the latest reorganisation of the Reserve Defence Force missed a golden opportunity to exploit the skills, qualifications and experience of the Reserve Defence Force. We would request that the Joint Committee consider our presentation and seek to commission an independent review and report on the Reserve Defence Force, with a view to identifying the real value associated with a reserve force and how this can be utilised in an Irish defence capability framework. This is what has happened with our international comparators, and the results have been resoundingly in favour of retaining, increasing and maximising the use of the reserve forces. We'd like to be part of this process, and we have our own suggestions on how the future of the Reserve Defence Force might look. We are eager to engage with you in this regard, although it will require a dedicated presentation and session of its own. Thank you for the time, and we are happy to take any questions on any of the items raised in the presentation.
Thanks very much. I think that certainly we would be interested in engaging with you if you have other suggestions to make at a maybe not too far away date. I would certainly. Deputy RDFRA, it's just you and I think. So do you want to?
Yeah, I think we'd have to emphasise to you that it's quality, not quantity, that we have here today.
Well said.
No, but look, I suppose first and foremost, Chairman, to indicate that, you know, I for my own part, I'm supportive of, in general, of what the Martin Cooney has said, and supportive of the presentation that has been put before us. Raised these matters on a number of occasions with the Minister in the House. One understands, I suppose, to one extent, the extent of the pressure that the Minister is currently under in terms of the economic difficulties that exist for all ministers trying to balance their budgets and what have you in terms of the permanent defence forces and then in terms of the reserves. But I think your point about volunteerism is well made, first and foremost. I think as a nation we are looking to volunteers to a far greater extent now than ever before. And you set out in your paper in considerable detail, I think, the effective contribution that the reservists can make as volunteers. So I think that has got to be taken on board. I think as well, Chairman, the Minister refutes your assertion that the force will cease to be in 3 or 4 years' time. I'm a bit worried about the Minister's assertion, and I think the committee could play a useful role. I think if, in line with what the Chairman has said, if it were possible for us to establish some sort of review of how it is that the reserve defence forces currently operate and how they might operate effectively into the future and how we might exploit the sort of benefits to the exchequer and indeed the benefits to communities and the benefits to the individuals involved that you set out in your paper. I think that is something that we would be well disposed to, and it's something that we should, in fact, I think, undertake. You point out as well in the course of your paper that one of the weaknesses that we have, and this is, I suppose, looking to the future, assuming that the reservists don't cease to exist, assuming that the committee undertakes a review, that we would need to look at the area of legislation. That the fact that people cannot take time off work as they can in other jurisdictions. Maybe you'd speak to us a little bit more about that, and do you envisage something akin to, I suppose, maternity leave or paternity leave being available to people as a matter of right where they become actively involved in the reservists? And then just finally, I think there's a desire on the part of the public at large to see people gainfully employed, to see the thousands of young people that are unemployed up and down the length and breadth of the country gainfully used in communities. Now, one immediately accepts that it is not the role of the defence forces, nor is it the role of the reservists to become involved in managing or training or whatever those large numbers of people that are available. Nonetheless, given the skill set of many of the young people that are unemployed across the length and breadth of the country, what is your reaction to the participation of a greater number of those young people in the reservists, be it naval level or at army or general military level? Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to take those questions? There are quite a number of them there.
Chairman, I might address them in the first instance, and I might invite some of my colleagues to come in. I'd just like to thank the Deputy for your very kind words, and I understand that the Minister would, we would disagree with the Minister's position in relation to the survival of the reserve. I think the framework that has now been put in place as part of the reorganisation completely disregards the fact that we do have lives outside of the Defence Forces, and that the KPIs and the conditions of service that are put upon us are particularly onerous. They're going to be very difficult for reservists to meet, to be effective, and that essentially the value for money review has said we're going to come back and look at this in 3 years' time. I think it's been established in such a way that it's going to be so difficult for us to meet those KPIs that at the end of 3 years they'll turn around and go, well, look, they couldn't do it. But it's going to be a case that we couldn't do it because you didn't help us do it, and you didn't put in the support to do it, and you didn't engage with us in the first place in respect of getting our input before you put those restrictions on us. So that would be an opening on that. In relation to protection of employment, I think we rely to a large extent at the moment on the goodwill of employers. If you take your statutory entitlement to annual leave at being 20 days, and you were expected to do 14 days training, full-time training, then you've essentially lost over half of you've lost half of your annual leave to it. And to now, reservists have given up either half their annual leave, or they've tried to take unpaid leave. And that puts you at a significant disadvantage in respect of where you are with your family life, and if you are working in a job where you could be self-employed and you can't take that time off. So again, it is a position, and it's submitted that you could do that quite easily with one piece of legislation, or you could amend the various existing pieces of employment legislation, such as the Employment Equality Act, the Unfair Dismissals Act, and so on, to include for provisions, and the Organisation of Working Time Act, to include for provisions for reservists, and to include for provisions preventing discrimination against reservists and protection of reservists. And I might ask, Rob Gilby here, who has looked at the international comparators. He can give you some information on what has happened on the comparators used in the VFM review.
Deputy, thank you again. As the Reserve Defence Force now comes into the single force concept, the single force concept, for the reserves, in order to become an essential part of the single force concept, the only way we can actually deliver on that within that structure is if the availability and the quality of the Reserve Defence Force is guaranteed. And in order for such a guarantee to take place, there needs to be a significant change in mindset. And as well, we also need to address the balance of support between government, the country, and its reserves. You know, in order to get the sort of societal benefit of the reserves, you really have to sort of pull that in through the employers, because, you know, we're all accountable to our employers. You know, if there was a need to mobilise reserves at short notice, you know, it's going to very much be a case of trying to almost herd cats without the legislative enablers to actually, you know, for that to happen. If we were to look at the international comparators that were looked at in the Value for Money review, there are the key commonalities between all those countries, which was New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the UK, is that all of them have employment protection legislation. Some of them use incentives in order to bring make use of their reserves. All of them have organisations that act as employer liaison councils, so that you know, so that there is a dialogue between defence and industry. In fact, they're given the report in 1999, the special study into the reserve, a liaison council between employers and defence was actually recommended, although this was never established. Further to that, the UK, which already has a significant sort of support for their reservists, are now actually changing their, or looking to change their legislative measures so they can mobilise their reserves domestically with greater ease. At the minute, they have to have a ministerial sign-off in order to call out the reserves, but they're looking to make that a much more local issue. The key point, I suppose, is that without employment legislation, you know, it's going to be very, very difficult to operationally use the Reserve Defence Force.
Okay. Go ahead, yeah, somebody else. Yeah.
I would like to direct your second point in relation to personnel and the large numbers unemployed. I think we would be absolutely delighted to take in large numbers of personnel into the Reserve Defence Forces and to train them and to expand the size of the Reserve Defence Forces. We have been choked in recent years as a result of the restrictions on recruiting and promotion. We've been choked of new lifeblood with an ageing force, and it is an area of great disappointment to us that we haven't been able to offer the many young people who are unemployed and without direction at the moment, to give them something to do in the meantime. And it is, if you look back on studies, it shows that in times of recession and economic hardship, that recruitment into such organisations is actually higher than it ever is before. And I'd actually like to call on Mr. Owen Colgan from the Naval Service Reserve, because they have a very integrated approach with the Naval Service. They actually engage on, they have a large number of operational outputs, and the starving